Hello, welcome. I say it's time to ditch whatever you are doing down here on planet Earth. Shall we scoot all around the solar system? Shall we find some of those strange science secrets? Welcome to the Fun Kids Science Weekly. My name's Dan. This is the podcast that learns everything possible in the universe, that discovers all those incredibly unique things that make us love science so much. This week, we'll find out what's with wind and discover how wind is actually made and what's it doing.
In simple terms, wind is just the movement of air, and that is caused by pressure differences, which is caused by temperature differences, and the main culprit behind it all is the sun.
And our Battle of the Science looks at how creatures have become who they are.
So I am an evolutionary biologist, which means I try to get a better understanding of the rules of evolution, which have resulted in this amazing diversity of animals, plants, and microbes that we can see all around us today.
Your Dangerous Dan this week is a tiny terror. It's amazing, with one of the best nicknames in the wild. You'll hear all about that in a brand new Fun Kids Science Weekly. Let's start with your science in the news. The sun is heading towards its busiest time. It's reaching its solar maximum, which is the time when it makes more radiation and more particles from solar flares are flung across the universe. This happens in an 11-year cycle, and we're right at the hotspot. They can supercharge the Earth's magnetic field, which is what causes the aurora borealis, the northern lights, if you're in the northern hemisphere, those stunning colours that sweep across the sky, which is good news, but also bad, because they can cause problems for satellites and power grids, because it can disrupt the way they work and the power that they get. Also, NASA has tasked Elon Musk's SpaceX company to bring down the International Space Station. SpaceX will build a vehicle capable of pushing the space station, which weighs 430 tons, into the Pacific Ocean safely in the next 10 years. Now, this project is said to cost over $800 million, and the space station have had crew on it all the time since the year 2000, so 24 years, and it's coming towards the end of its life. I'm very intrigued to hear how SpaceX is going to get on. How are you going to take a massive superstructure, a proper space station in the sky, and bring it down into our ocean safely? We'll find out. And for our final story this week, archaeologists have uncovered what they believe to be signs of prehistoric life in Faversham, which is in Kent in the UK. And the Kent Archaeological Society believes that this burial site dates back between 1,500 and 3,000 years. Let's find out more. Richard Taylor is General Manager at Kent Archaeological Society. Richard, thank you for being there. Let's start. How did you know where to dig?
Hi, Dan. It's a good question. We knew where to dig. Two reasons. One, we saw a large mound. And secondly, we also saw very peculiar ring shapes in the ground on aerial photography.
And what's the process between you digging it and you finding out how old it is? Is it simply as easy as you getting a few pots and pans from the ground, you looking at it and saying, right, that's about 1,000 years old? Or is it a bit longer than that?
It's a bit longer than that. So we dig excavation trenches, and we find things in the places that we're interested in. And straight away, if you find something really interesting, like, for example, I've got this piece of flint here, and it's actually about 4,000 to 5,000 years old.
Okay, so what you're holding up in front of me is amazing. It looks like quite a shiny, short, jagged cutting of rock. As you say, something that would be from a flint knife. So I mentioned pots and pans. What else have you found in Faversham?
Well, we've also found lots of prehistoric pottery, which goes back to about 3000 BC. That's 3,000 years before the Romans arrived. So it's really, really old.
Yeah, so you're showing me what looks to be a triangular cutting. It's slightly domed and curved from what might be the side of a bowl. These are amazing finds. What's it told us, though, about what we think life was like back then?
Well, what it's told us for this particular site is that they were using this site to bury people. It's where they were looking after the dead. So they were burying them in large earthen mounds. And what they left behind were offerings like pots or bowls full of berries and things like that. So celebrating the dead. So this was a previously unknown prehistoric burial landscape, which we found.
And this was some time ago. I mentioned 1,500 to 3,000 years ago. You've showed us something that's 5,000 years old. What do we know about the type of people that might have been living in England back then?
That's the really interesting thing. We don't know much about them at all. They were probably like you and I, but we don't know, for instance, what language they spoke. No idea. All we've got left is what they left behind, which is the flint tools, maybe some bones, pottery, that sort of thing.
And how exciting is it for you? It seems quite frequently now that we're finding brand new hoards of stuff from thousands of years ago and we didn't have any idea that it was there, and that blows my mind. What's it like for you, being part of an archaeological society and discovering new things from so long ago quite often now?
For example, I'll quickly show you. On the ground, we actually found this. So this is a hand axe, and this was made by a Neanderthal, which isn't the same as us. And that is about 150,000 years old.
Wow, yeah, it looks so precious. Maybe even expensive. It looks like some strange crystal quartz that you would find on the end of a necklace that looks so shiny.
It is. It's in great condition considering how old it is. And it's a small hand axe, so they would have used it for chopping. But to hold something like that, that's 150,000 years old, we think, is amazing.
Well, it's been a real delight just to uncover some of the past with you. Thank you so much, Richard Taylor from Kent Archaeological Society. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Let's get to your questions then. If you have anything sciencey that you want answered on the show, the best thing that you can do is to leave it as a voice note for me. You can do that on the free Fun Kids app or at funkidslive.com. I love that because then you star in our show. I get to hear how much you love the podcast. So best to do that. Here is a message, though, that has been sent in from someone anonymous. If you're going to send in a message and write it down, please do leave your name. You have said you're the science ambassador for your class at school, which is brilliant news. I hope that this podcast really helps you out with that. The question is, what are atoms made of? Well, atoms are tiny. They are the building blocks of all life. They are like the Lego bricks that you fit together to make the castle, whatever you're building. And atoms, they are so tiny, but they're made of something even smaller. They are made of subatomic particles. You've got your protons. They are found in the nucleus, right in the middle. Then you've got your neutrons, also found in the middle. And then you have electrons, which spin around the edge. Quite often when you see diagrams and pictures of atoms, they're presented looking a bit like the solar system. You know, you've got the sun in the centre and then the planets orbit the outside. Well, that's the nucleus with your proton, with your neutron, and the electrons all around the outside. The amount of electrons usually determines what element that atom is. Also, how strong, weak, light and heavy and dense that atom is as well. And the way the atoms fit together is by electrons merging and swapping with other atoms. That's how you get different materials and different compounds. And inside those subatomic particles, you've got stuff that is even smaller, called quarks. I love the name quarks. It's a proper sciencey word, isn't it? It's like whoever discovered it, the experts are like, what can we call this? It needs to sound smart and very sci-fi, very futuristic. I think a quark might do. I love it. Thank you so much for the question. Next time, leave your name on it. And next time, best to send a voice note for me on the Fun Kids app. You can do it at funkidslive.com too. Like this one from Jacob. What do you have, Jacob?
How is wind created?
Well, Jacob, thank you very much for that. How is wind created? I tell you why it's a brilliant question, because it's around us all of the time. We experience it, I imagine, every single day. Yeah, it's quite tricky to think of the last time we asked, how does that work? Well, let's find out, shall we? Kirsty McCabe is an absolute legend, been on before, back on from the Royal Meteorological Society. Kirsty, thank you so much for coming on again. So, how do we start by explaining where wind comes from?
In simple terms, wind is just the movement of air, and that is caused by pressure differences, which is caused by temperature differences, and the main culprit behind it all is the sun. So because the sun doesn't heat things up evenly, we end up with temperature differences between the hills and the oceans, between, the equator and the poles. And so the world is always trying to get itself back into balance. And the easiest way to do that is for air to move from where it's hot to where it's cold. So you get a rush of air filling in the gaps in places. So when we get the temperature differences and the pressure differences, we get the air moving in, and that's what we get as wind.
And it moving from one place to another, is that also to do with hot air? As it warms, it rises, which pushes cold air down. Does this all feed into it?
Yep. I mean, there's a really good example of something you might have heard of, the sea breeze. So if you go to the coast on a nice, warm, sunny day, quite often during the afternoon, you start to notice this breeze coming off the sea, which can be lovely and refreshing. And that's set up with a little sort of local scale circulation. And that's because the land heats up much more quickly than the sea. And so when the hot air rises over the land, it causes the pressure to drop. You end up with lower pressure at the surface over the land than over the sea. And then you get the air coming from the sea to fill in the gaps. So air moves in from the sea. And then high up in the air, you've got the air going the opposite way from the land to the sea. So you end up with this little circulation. And that's the sea breeze circulation. So it can happen really in all different levels. So on that smaller local scale where you get the nice breeze from the sea, but on the other coast, nothing, to bigger circulation patterns where we've got the air moving on much bigger scales from the equators to the poles.
Let's talk a little bit about that if we can. So when we're seeing huge scales of weather, potentially quite violent winds, how are they all being made by just simply hot and cold air moving about?
Well, there's obviously a lot more going on when we think about some of our most violent winds and those associated with things like hurricanes, typhoons and cyclones. Now, they're all the same thing, but they form in different parts of the world, so they get different names. And that's a really big, really nasty low, but it's a tropical system, so it's got a lot of energy in it. And it's got these very strong winds indeed. But that covers quite a big area and brings some very strong and destructive winds. And again, it's all to do with temperature and the sun playing a role there, because for things like a hurricane to form, it needs the sea surface temperatures to be above a certain amount because it needs that warmth to fuel it. And then it needs certain wind conditions to be happening up above. So it needs not too much wind shear, because wind shear is when, as you go up in the atmosphere, the wind changes direction with height. It changes speed and direction. What you want is the hurricane to be able to grow. So you don't want much wind shear. You want it to be able to grow and not get cut off too soon. Or maybe you don't want that. Depends if you want a hurricane or not, of course. So all these things come into factor with the heat and the wind. But the most violent destructive winds we get are those with something a little bit smaller than a hurricane. And obviously, as most people have heard of, tornadoes or twisters. And they occur in a much smaller scale, but they're much more violent winds. They can be up to 250 miles an hour. So you get these really fast rotating columns of wind that can maybe take down a street or a house, but the one next door is absolutely untouched because they're very localized, but again, very destructive. And for those to form, again, you need to have various factors at play. You need some warm air coming from the south, colder, dry air coming from the north, and then you need just the right conditions to get things to spin. So there's a lot of different factors that go into play in forming these really destructive things. Luckily, we don't see too many of those in the UK, though.
Wonderful. Well, Kirsty McCabe from the Royal Meteorological Society, thank you so much for explaining that for us. Thank you very much to Kirsty. If you would like an expert answering your question next week on the show, a proper genius from that field taking you through everything, make sure you leave it as a voice note for me, all right, on the free Fun Kids app, or you can do it at funkidslive.com too. And it's time for our Dangerous Dan, where we look at some of the most mean, weird, strange and unique things in the universe. We're heading to the wild tundra around the northern hemisphere. We are searching through scattered trees and shrubs to take a peek at the northern shrike. They have the most amazing nickname in the wild. They are medium-sized songbirds. They make an amazing noise. They're normally grey and white. They've got this black mask across their face. That's what it looks like anyway. Their head is quite chunky. They're a pint-sized predator with a bull-type head. They've got a powerful hooked beak as well, with viciously sharp talons. Even though they're small, they're incredibly aggressive hunters, swooping towards mammals, insects, reptiles, and even other birds. Now, they earn their place on this dangerous Dan list because of their fascinating and gruesome hunting method. Now, they're stealthy hunters. They like to ambush their prey. They've got a tooth-like spike on their bill. They use that for a quick bite to the neck, which helps kill their prey swiftly. Now, they often end up killing much more than they need, but they don't ever let anything go to waste. They're a bit like your nan, like that. No, we'll save that for later. They do that with their food, with their prey, by impaling it on spines of trees or on barbed wire. They are leaving it for later, leaving it until they're hungry again. We don't really know too many animals that do that, so they will take down so much prey, they are a pint-sized predator, and they will leave it to come back when they're snacking, when they're hungry, and that gives them this incredible nickname, the butcher bird. Anything like that. The butcher bird, the northern shrike, needs to go straight onto our Dangerous Dan list. Let's do this week's Battle of the Sciences then, where we try and discover, officially, the greatest science in the history of the universe, and there's been quite a few. We're finding out who is first in their field. We're heading to the University of Stirling this week up in Scotland, chatting to Reuben Knoll. This is all about animal evolutionary biology, which are three very smart words. Reuben, you start with 1 minute to tell us why your science is the best. That minute kicks off in 3, 2, 1, go!
Okay, hello everybody. So I am an evolutionary biologist, which means I try to get a better understanding of the rules of evolution, which have resulted in this amazing diversity of animals, plants, and microbes that we can see all around us today. So I don't know if I can say for absolute certain that my field is the absolute best, but I do think it's a really important and fascinating area to work in. So, for example, you can work with some really cool natural systems, often in amazing locations all around the world. So, for example, I have colleagues who work on how birds and animals might cope with climate change, or my own research, which looks at this group of fascinating microscopic animals called rotifers, which we very recently discovered have stolen a bunch of genes from bacteria, which the rotifers then use to produce drugs, which help them fight off their own diseases. And you can also work on some really important questions all across biology, including how microbes which cause diseases can change their genetics to evade the drugs that we use to try and stop them, or how the bugs which cause new diseases, like COVID, for example, have managed to jump from infecting animals to infecting humans.
There is your minute, Reuben. So there's a lot to unpack there. I think we'll start, if that's okay, at the very beginning of our knowledge of evolution. So it's this thing that we might have heard a lot about, survival of the fittest. But just at a very basic level, Reuben, can you explain how animals evolve from each other, how that's happened for millions of years to become the creatures that we are today?
So I suppose you can understand it by thinking of a group of animals, let's say, or organisms, and every organism has stuff called DNA inside them. And that DNA is like a recipe or an instruction manual to make that particular organism. Everything from its body plan to how it interacts with the world around it, and how it feeds, everything else. And so that's the sort of starting point, if you like. And then on top of that, you have a process called mutation. And mutation is a random process which changes little bits of your DNA randomly across your instruction manual, if you like. And so with those changes, that will obviously make small, subtle changes to how those animals look or behave or anything else. And that allows variation to exist within the population of animals. And that means that they can slowly adapt and change to inhabit, for example, different parts of the world, different things we call niches. And over many millions of years, hundreds of millions of years, or 4 billion years or so since life has been on this planet, if you kind of look at that process along those kinds of timescales, then you can imagine that through this accumulation of small changes, these changes allowing all of these different animals to move into these different niches, then you can arrive at the diversity of plants and animals that we see today.
It's wonderful how it's so utterly random as well, that this has been going on and on and on, and we find ourselves where we are. Now, In your time working in animal evolutionary biology, what's the one really amazing thing that you've learned that has just utterly stumped you and you couldn't believe it?
I suppose coming back closer to home, I work on a process that's called horizontal gene transfer, which I already talked a bit about in my minute. And this is a process whereby bits of DNA can jump around the tree of life. So you can have a piece of DNA, for example, which has spent billions of years evolving in a bacteria. And then through this process called horizontal gene transfer, this gene from bacteria can then jump into something like an animal and have a whole new effect in animal. So this idea that in fact the boundaries which define different species are quite strict, which has been an idea that's been around for a long time. Just recently, we're starting to understand that these boundaries might be a bit more permeable, if you like, than first thought, and that genes, particularly in plants and animals, can potentially jump across huge evolutionary distances. That's something which has been quite a leap forward in our understanding of evolution.
Why, with all the animals that you could be looking at, with everything that you could be learning about so many stunningly beautiful creatures, why are you focusing on teeny tiny microscopic ones?
Well, partly because there's a lot of unexplored kind of information amongst the teeny tiny organisms that hitherto have been, let's say, neglected a little bit. So large, fluffy animals, they're great and they're fantastic to look at, and lots of my colleagues do really important work on them. But I think there's a whole wealth of information and new discoveries to be made by looking at those small things which, until recently, until the advent of genetic analyses, we haven't really been able to fully understand. So it's like a new frontier. It's an unexplored area of science, is to try and understand the genetics and the biochemical processes which might be going on in this part of life.
Do we think animal evolutionary biology gets it near the top of our best battle of the sciences list? Well, there's loads more to discover. Reuben Noel is from the University of Stirling. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Really good to hear from Reuben Noel, all about animal evolution, how creatures become who they are. And, well, it's inspired me to hear more about this. So let's get on an episode from our Inside Biology series with Marina Ventura. She's an expert on everything that happens deep down under the ocean. She's a genius. And this time, we're finding out how fish have evolved, how they've become what they are today, and particularly a salmon's journey travelling from a baby egg to an adult.
Marina Ventura Inside Biology with the Society of Biology. Hold on tight.
Hi there. Animals make some of the most amazing journeys as part of their everyday lives. And one of the more fascinating journeys is made by the salmon. The salmon's journey begins and ends here, in a freshwater stream. Let's get closer. It's all happening under the water. As we go deep down to the gravelly bed, we can see the eggs. Hundreds of thousands of them. This environment is a perfect place for baby fish. There's lots of the food that young fish will need. Insects from the land and fresh water. A good supply of oxygen from the flowing water. And plenty of nooks and crannies to hide in. Oh, that baby salmon is tiny. Cute. But only 1 in 10 of these babies will survive to the next stage. Let's see what happens next to those that make it. We're a little further downstream now, and the salmon swimming in this part of the river are much bigger. The young fish are known as smolts. They're about as long as a pencil and have become more silvery. They've changed on the inside too. Their bodies have changed to survive in saltier waters, which is going to be very important given where they're headed. Any ideas where that might be? That's right, it's the sea! Some smolts take a year to travel to the sea. Others might take 5 years or more. It all depends on where in the world they are, but once in the sea, it's a salmon's paradise. The sea is where salmon spend most of their life. Over the next couple of years, they'll get bigger and fatter as they grow. Their whole bodies change, growing humps, canine-shaped teeth and a curved jaw. And they'll also become darker in colour. This is where the really astonishing part of the journey begins. While I head back to dry land, Map App, tell us all about it.
The electronic essential for every explorer.
When they're fully grown, every salmon leaves the sea to begin a journey back to the very place that they were born. They'll swim hundreds of miles to reach the freshwater rivers. There's an American species that will travel nearly 1,000 miles. Because the sea is at a lower level than the rivers, salmon have to swim upstream and against the flow of the river at every step of the way. If you've ever swum in the sea, you'll know how hard it can be to swim against the current. How they find their way is something of a mystery, although it's thought to be connected with their keen sense of smell. Once they've reached their spawning ground and laid their eggs, most of the salmon will die, in the very place that they were born.
So you can see why these freshwater habitats are important for all salmon, not just the babies. See you next time, adventurers. In the meantime, find out more at funkidslive.com/biology.
Marina Ventura Inside Biology with the Society of Biology. Hold on tight.
And that's it for this week's Fun Kids Science Weekly. Thank you so much to all of our experts for coming on the show. If you have a question that you would love to hear answered next week, make sure you leave it as a voice note for me on the free Fun Kids app or at funkidslive.com. We've got loads of brilliant episodes of tons of podcast series that you can get on the app, on the website, and even more when you subscribe to Fun Kids Podcast Plus. Take a look at that at funkidslive.com. And Fun Kids, we are a children's radio station from the UK. Listen on the website, on the free Fun Kids app, and if you've got a smart speaker, wake it up and ask it to play Fun Kids.